Hello everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a world where a full drink of water was as rare as a polite sandstorm. From sipping warm camel milk like it's fine wine, to chewing bitter melon just to keep your tongue from sticking to your teeth, to milking the morning dew off a rock before the sun steals it. This is how people once kept themselves alive without a single well in sight. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy wandering into strange corners of human history with me. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious if you're hearing this with a cold drink in your hand, or if the irony is about to hit you mid-sip. Now, let's make this a small ritual. Lower the lights, find a quiet spot, maybe let a fan hum in the background. Settle in, and let's begin walking slowly into a land where thirst shaped every decision. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, not the one sipping overpriced bottled water while pretending to like the taste, but the one who hasn't seen a drop of the stuff in 10 days and is still supposed to keep walking. Imagine being born somewhere, the horizon is just heat and rock, and the idea of running out of water isn't a crisis, it's the default setting. You wouldn't be asking, where's the nearest tap? You'd be asking, when was the last time anyone saw a cloud? If you'd come into the world in one of those stubborn little human clusters that existed before wells, your life would have been an endless, delicate conversation with thirst. Water wasn't something you drank, it was something you plotted around, like a siege or a scandal. People survived on a mental map of every seasonal spring, every half-dry riverbed, every hollow in the rock that might hold rainwater for a few days before the sun licked it clean. And you wouldn't have found that map in a leather-bound notebook. It would have been in the heads of the oldest people you knew, the ones who could glance at the color of grass on a distant slope and tell you whether it hid a trickle of water beneath. They'd also know exactly which green patch didn't mean water, just some smug desert plant pretending to be helpful while hoarding moisture in its roots like a miser. This knowledge wasn't shared lightly. In some cultures, revealing the location of a hidden spring to an outsider could get you cast out, which in the desert is just a polite way of saying executed by climate. If you were lucky enough to inherit that knowledge, it came with the same weight as inheriting the family's last camel. Lose it, and you'd doom everyone. And even if you knew where the water was, there was the problem of actually reaching it. The distances weren't measured in kilometers. They were measured in, can we make it before the weakest person collapses? Entire migrations were planned not around fertile grazing grounds, but around those rare, inconvenient puddles that appeared after a short, smug rainstorm. People would shift their whole lives like chess pieces just to stand near a pool that might vanish tomorrow. You'd learn quickly that water isn't precious in the way a modern tourist brochure says it. It's precious in the way oxygen is precious, essential, invisible, and somehow always about to run out. You'd ration it without thinking. A sip in the morning, a sip at night. Anything more was reckless. You wouldn't waste it on washing dust. It's clean enough if you just pretend it's skincare. And you'd ever gulp. Only outsiders gulp. Outsiders also tend to die. Every decision you made would loop back to the same silent question. Is this worth the water it will cost me? Speaking too much. It costs water. Walking too far. It costs water. Laughing until you cry. An unacceptable luxury. And when you finally did drink, you'd do it in that slow, ceremonial way people now reserve for wine tastings, because you'd know it might be days before you could do it again. And yet, despite the scarcity, people lived. The entire cultures thrived. Which should make you wonder, if they weren't drinking water every day, what on earth were they drinking? If you'd been born to the sand instead of the sidewalk, your idea of a map wouldn't have involved paper, compasses, or politely printed scales in the corner. Your map would have been a living thing, stitched into stories, sung in half-remembered songs, and embedded in the peculiar way elders paused mid-sentence to squint at a hill 2 days' walk away. Forget GPS. Your navigation system was built out of gossip and geology. You'd learn to read the land the way other people read faces, spotting the faint crease in a dune that meant wind had scooped a path to a hidden basin, or the slightly greener tuft of grass in an otherwise dead plain that betrayed the presence of seepwater. You'd notice when birds flew low and tight in the heat, circling like gossipy neighbors. It meant there was a drinking spot nearby, though maybe not one big enough to share. These were not casual observations, they were survival code. Among the Bedouin, Tuareg, and other desert peoples, the location of springs, geltas, or seasonal wadis was a kind of family currency, inherited, guarded, and doled out sparingly. Tell the wrong person, and you weren't just risking the spring being drained dry. You were risking being responsible for a dozen other people's dehydration. In some places, revealing a hidden source without permission wasn't just frowned upon. It was grounds for punishment, severe enough to make you wish you'd just died of thirst in the first place. You'd also discover that water sources in deserts aren't all friendly little oases, with palm trees swaying in a cinematic breeze. Some are brackish pools that taste like liquid regret. Others are so deep in a rock crevice, you have to send the youngest, skinniest member of the group down with a goat bladder and a prayer. And then there are the cruel ones, seasonal springs that appear one year and vanish the next, as if the land is just toying with you. The knowledge of where to find them wasn't written down, because writing could be stolen or lost. Instead, it was hidden in proverbs, metaphors, and odd-sounding instructions that only made sense if you knew the land. Follow the wind, where it smells like wet stone. Where the gazelle sleeps, water sleeps too. Outsiders might dismiss these as poetic ramblings. Insiders knew they were GPS coordinates disguised as bedtime philosophy. Sometimes, the indicators were so subtle you'd think they were superstition. A slightly different shade of dust, the presence of a certain kind of beetle, even the pattern of cracks in the earth, some splitting toward nothing, others leading like veins to a hidden source. And because all of this was stored in human memory, it could vanish in a single unlucky generation. If drought wiped out a community before they could pass the knowledge on, the desert reclaimed its secrets without a trace. And in this world, not knowing meant dying. Which is why every step you took was measured against what you knew, what you'd heard, and who you could trust. And if you think finding the water was the hardest part, well, you haven't yet learned what people did to stay hydrated when they couldn't find it at all. If you'd been dropped into a desert before wells and pipes, you'd have learned quickly that drinking water was a modern luxury. In your world, hydration often came with chew marks. The trick wasn't finding a clear, shimmering pool. It was finding something alive or green enough to steal moisture from before the sun got to it first. You'd start with plants, not the polite salad leaf kind, but the stubborn, slightly rude ones that survived by hiding their water where you had to fight for it. The desert melon, bland, fibrous, about as exciting as chewing on a damp sponge, might save your life. So would wild cucumbers, bitter enough to make your teeth question their purpose. The sand of the Kalahari, for example, relied on the Zama melon during the dry season, cracking it open and eating both the pulp and seeds for hydration. It wasn't a treat. It was a slow, deliberate negotiation between your mouth and your survival. Then there was cactus, the ultimate middle finger to thirst. Not all cacti are edible, but the ones that are require peeling away the spines with the caution of a bomb disposal expert. One slip, and you're bleeding water instead of gaining it. Peel it right, though, and you'd get a cool, mucilaginous bite that felt miraculous until you realized you still had sand in your teeth. Meat could be water too, though you wouldn't think it at first. Freshly killed animals, antelope, hare, even lizards held precious liquid in their tissues, especially if cooked lightly or eaten raw in emergency. You wouldn't eat for the taste. You'd eat because that muscle fiber was your canteen. And then there was milk. If your people herded camels, goats, or sheep, milk wasn't just food, it was your hydration strategy. In the Sahara and Arabian deserts, nomads could go weeks without plain water, drinking only fresh milk from their animals, rich in fat and electrolytes. It replaced what the sun was constantly stealing. You'd sip it slowly, because chugging milk in 40 degrees Celsius heat was a bad idea, unless you enjoyed regretting all your life choices at once. Some cultures took this a step further. In northern Kenya, the Rendle and Somali pastoralists would mix fresh blood from their camels with milk, warm, iron-rich, and surprisingly sustaining. To an outsider, it might seem grim. To you, it would be just Tuesday's lunch. No more shocking than squeezing an orange. Blood wasn't a novelty. It was a portable hydration pack. Dates, the sweet little energy bombs of desert life, would also play their role, but never alone. Eaten without milk or water, they could pull moisture from your body as quickly as they gave sugar. so you'd pair them with fat or liquid, creating a balance the desert couldn't immediately rob from you. The strange thing is, once you'd lived like this long enough, you wouldn't crave cold water anymore. You'd crave texture, the crunch of melon seeds, the chew of raw root, the oily slide of fresh milk. Hydration would stop being about a glass and start being about the hunt, the bite, the slow, stubborn trickle of moisture from the most unexpected places. But if you think that's odd, wait until you see how far people went in finding other liquid sources when the plants ran out and the milk dried up. If you'd been born into a place where the horizon never promised rain, you'd learn early that your most reliable well might be walking beside you on 4 legs, not a metaphor. In many desert cultures, your camel, goat, or sheep wasn't just transport or dinner, it was your hydration system, breathing, bleating, and occasionally looking at you like it knew exactly how much you depended on it. Camel milk was the crown jewel, rich, slightly salty, and full of electrolytes. It could sustain you for days without a drop of water. Nomadic groups across the Sahara, Arabian Peninsula, and parts of Central Asia have lived entirely off camel milk during long migrations, drinking it fresh and sometimes slightly fermented to make it keep longer, and you wouldn't gulp it. Oh no, you'd sip it like an investment, because this wasn't a fridge-stocked commodity. It was the day's ration from a living creature that might be just as thirsty as you. Then there was goat and sheep milk, not as fatty as camel milk, but easier to get in small, steady amounts. Herding meant you always had something to drink, even if it wasn't water. In fact, in some seasons, the animals themselves were better hydrated than any human in the camp, and you'd quietly envy them every time you saw them chewing on some stubborn shrub. And then we get to the part where your modern self might hesitate. Blood. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Among the Maasai, Rendle, and some Tuareg groups, fresh animal blood has been, and still is, tapped from livestock as an emergency hydration and nutrient source, not from slaughter, but by nicking a vein in the neck of a cow or camel, drawing a pint or so, and letting the animal live to produce more. The blood's iron content, proteins, and liquid volume could keep you going in the absence of milk or edible plants. You wouldn't think of it as gruesome. You'd think of it the way you now think of opening a juice carton. Practical, necessary, a skill passed down through generations, with just as much ceremony as bread making or fire starting. In some places, the blood was mixed with milk to make it more palatable and nutrient balanced, a combination that could be stored for a short time without spoiling in the dry heat. Even the liquid from an animal's stomach, what you'd probably call unpleasant, and they'd call life-saving, had its place. Among some pastoral nomads, in severe emergencies, water from a freshly slaughtered animal's stomach could be drunk, filtered through cloth to remove debris. It wouldn't taste good, but survival doesn't care about your palate. And through all this, you'd learn something you'll never read on an inspirational quote poster. Survival in the desert isn't about finding fresh, clear storybook water. It's about accepting every fluid the land gives you, whether it comes from the ground, the plant, or the animal standing next to you. But even if you had all the milk and blood in the world, there was still another crucial skill, making sure you didn't waste your body's own water in the first place. In the desert, the real leak isn't your canteen, it's you. Every drop of sweat is a personal bankruptcy notice your body serves to itself, which is why people who knew what they were doing treated perspiration like gold dust, too valuable to waste on things like hurrying or showing enthusiasm. The rule was simple. You moved when the sun wasn't looking. Early morning, before the light hit hard enough to sting, or late evening, when the shadows grew long enough to pretend they might be cooler. Midday. That was for finding shade, any scrap of it, and becoming part of the scenery. A human rock, a lizard impersonator. You didn't walk, you didn't talk, and you definitely didn't stand around making grand gestures like some visiting dignitary. Clothing wasn't about looking like the hero of an epic travel novel. It was a personal climate control system. Long, loose garments in pale colors created a thin pocket of cooler air between fabric and skin. The Tuareg's indigo robes, for example, weren't just striking, they protected from heat, reduced sunburn, and slowed down moisture loss. The fact that the dye stained their skin blue was incidental, and possibly a quiet point of pride. Shade was currency. Travelers learned to cast it for themselves, using cloaks, hoods, and headwraps that shielded the face and neck. A wide, stiff cloth could double as a personal tent. Even camels were used as mobile walls against the sun. Walking on the shaded side was worth adjusting your entire route. Pacing mattered. Long, slow strides kept the heart rate low and the sweat glands asleep. Rest stops weren't optional. They were built into the day like punctuation in a sentence. You'd pause in shallow depressions where wind patterns made the air fractionally cooler, or huddle behind boulders to escape the direct glare. Salt was another balancing act. Lose too much through sweat and muscles seized like rusted hinges. Take in too much from food, and you'd need water you didn't have. So people avoided heavily salted meat, unless it came with milk or something moist enough to balance it. The whole point was to keep the body's internal reservoir topped up, not slowly siphoned away by heat and bad choices. Even speech was rationed. Talking too much dried the mouth, made you swallow more, and encouraged unnecessary breathing through the mouth. So conversations in the heat were clipped, practical, and often replaced by hand signals. Silence wasn't just golden, it was hydrating. And perhaps the strangest part, people trained themselves for this. Children grew up with deliberate water restrictions to condition their bodies to use less and panic less when thirsty. It wasn't cruelty, it was insurance. A body that can survive longer without water isn't a miracle. It's muscle memory, drilled in over years. Still, even the best trained bodies need some intake eventually, which meant knowing how to store what little you had so it didn't vanish before you reached the next source. Salt in the desert is a tricky acquaintance, the kind who'll save your life one day and ruin it the next. You can't survive without it, but too much will have you begging for water you can't find. People learned that the hard way, and then passed the knowledge down like a family secret with teeth marks in it. Sweat takes salt with it when it leaves, and without salt, muscles cramp, minds fog, and even the strongest walker starts stumbling like they've had too much date wine. But add too much salt back into the system without enough liquid to dilute it, and it pulls water out of your cells, shrinking them like fruit left in the sun. You don't feel clever in that state, you just feel drier, thirstier, and more convinced that the gods are holding a grudge. The solution was balance, which meant thinking about salt before you even thought about food. In some desert communities, meat preserved with heavy salting was kept for wetter seasons, when water was easier to find. In the long dry stretches, meat was dried without excess salt or eaten fresh to avoid overloading the body. Even dairy wasn't taken for granted. Salted cheese or butter was handled with caution, eaten alongside moist foods like fresh camel milk, cactus pulp, or melon flesh. And yet, salt was also medicine. A pinch in water, when you actually had some, could help the body absorb it faster. It could prevent the kind of full-body fatigue that crept in after days of walking. It was also a preservative for precious liquids like milk or blood, keeping them safe just long enough to stretch supplies across more days. Salt was both the lock and the key. It shaped trade. In parts of the Sahara, salt wasn't just something you carried. It was something you crossed hundreds of kilometers to get. Blocks of it were traded like treasure, because without it, even a full water skin couldn't keep you alive for long. But a single careless meal with too much of it could mean the opposite problem, an urgent thirst you couldn't afford to satisfy. People developed rituals around it. A pinch here, never a fistful. Never eaten alone, never consumed thoughtlessly. Even travelers new to the desert learned fast, usually after one salt-heavy dinner, followed by a night of dry mouth so intense they'd have traded their best camel for a single sip of water. Salt, handled well, kept you walking. Handled badly, it made you your own worst enemy. And it was just one piece of the bigger, stranger puzzle, training your body to survive with less water than it actually wanted, without letting thirst make you reckless. The desert doesn't care how hydrated you were yesterday. It only cares how long you can keep going after today's last sip. Which is why people who lasted out here didn't just endure thirst, they trained for it, the way you'd train a muscle. Survival wasn't just about knowing where to find water. It was about convincing your body not to panic when it wasn't there. It started young. Children in nomadic families didn't grow up with unlimited drinks sloshing in their stomachs. Water was rationed, not cruelly, but deliberately, so the body learned to stretch what it had. A few mouthfuls in the morning, maybe a bit of milk later, and the rest was mental discipline. Panic wastes energy, wastes water. So you learned early that thirst didn't mean now. It meant eventually. Physical conditioning was subtle. You moved slower than a city visitor might think reasonable. You rested before you felt tired. You shielded your skin, not for modesty, but because every sunburn was another way to bleed moisture into the air. You didn't stand in the wind unless it was cool. Dry wind steals hydration faster than you notice it's gone. And you didn't eat dry food unless you were prepared to pay the water debt it would create in digestion. Some groups had literal thirst drills, walking for hours with no water, then drinking only a measured amount, just enough to replace what the body needed, not enough to indulge it. Over time, your sweat response dulled. Your body stopped trying to cool you with every rise in temperature. You became efficient, like a well-built stove instead of a bonfire. Even the mouth was trained, chewing slowly, breathing through the nose, avoiding unnecessary swallowing, small things that, over days, added up to hours more survival. You learned to savor the idea of water as much as the taste, because your next real drink might be days away. And when you finally did drink, it wasn't a long, blissful chug. That's for people who don't understand the consequences. Too quickly could shock the stomach, flush out salts, or even make you ill. No, you sipped, swished, and swallowed like it was part of a ritual. Because in a way, it was. This conditioning wasn't superstition. Studies of desert-adapted peoples from the Bedouin to the San show real physiological differences: lower sweat rates, slower urine production, and better tolerance for mild dehydration. Generations of living underwater, scarcity literally rewrote how the body behaved. Of course, even the most trained body couldn't conjure water out of nowhere, which meant you also needed to know how to store and protect what little you had, long before pottery or metal containers existed, before wells, before clay jars, before anything resembling a modern bottle. Carrying water across a desert was an exercise in both creativity and paranoia. You weren't storing a drink. You were storing the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming an anecdote told by people who shook their heads and said, they should have known better. Animal skins were the classic choice. Goat or camel hides, cleaned, treated with fat or resin, and sewn watertight, could hold precious liters. They weren't light, and they definitely weren't elegant, more like lugging around a warm, sloshing organ, but they worked. In some cases, the hair was left on the outside to help insulate against heat. You'd hang the skin from a saddle or carry it over a shoulder, knowing full well that every bounce risked spilling a mouthful you couldn't afford to lose. Then there were gourds. In regions where they grew, like parts of Africa and India, they were dried, hollowed, and sealed. Lighter than skins, easier to carry, and less prone to leaking, but they came with a catch. Drop one, and you'd be licking water out of the sand before the sun had a chance to evaporate it. Which, by the way, you would absolutely do without shame. Some groups wove tight baskets and coated them with pine, resin, gum arabic, or bitumen to make them waterproof. These weren't everyday containers. They were for emergencies, often kept hidden at waypoints along a route. Knowing where one was buried could mean life or death for someone making a crossing. Not everyone shared that knowledge. Storage wasn't just about the container. It was about keeping the water from disappearing on its own. In heat, evaporation was the enemy. People learned to keep skins in the shade, wrap them in damp cloth to cool by evaporation, sacrificing a little water to save more, or bury them just deep enough that the earth itself became insulation. In some cases, small caches were hidden in rock crevices or under cairns to mark their spot, though not too obviously, lest someone else borrow them. The water inside these containers wasn't always pristine. A week in a skin, and it could taste like whatever the animal ate last. A gourd might give it a faintly vegetal tang, but the point wasn't refreshment. The point was keeping liquid in a state that could still move through your throat and keep you walking. And here's the part that made it all even more tense. You didn't drink from the container casually. Every opening was a risk, spilling, contaminating, or just revealing to anyone nearby exactly how much you had left. Thirst wasn't just physical, it was political. In the wrong company, your water could become their water faster than you could close the stopper. Which is why, for most desert peoples, storing water was only half the equation. The other half was never needing to store too much in the first place by moving where the water already was. In the desert, home wasn't an address, it was wherever the water happened to be this month. Staying put was a luxury the land wouldn't allow. When the rain fell, you moved toward it. When the pools dried, you moved away. And you did it quickly, because nothing attracts competition faster than the rumor of a full wadi. These migrations weren't casual strolls. They were planned with the precision of a military campaign. The elders knew the timing of seasonal rains, the flood patterns of dry riverbeds, and the life cycle of ephemeral lakes that appeared after storms and vanished like a bad promise. The whole camp, tents, animals, tools, food stores could be dismantled and loaded within hours, ready to follow the weather like a shadow. The routes themselves were part of the cultural inheritance. You didn't just pick a direction and hope. You followed paths that wound between known grazing spots for animals, shaded rest points, and the rare, blessed waterholes that had a reputation for sticking around more than a week. The knowledge was too important to be left to chance, and too dangerous to be given to strangers. Moving with the water also meant moving with the plants and animals that depended on it. Herds of gazelle, camel or goats were not just company. They were living indicators that water was nearby or soon to be gone. In East African deserts, for example, pastoralists still track animal migration patterns to anticipate where temporary rivers will form. But the movement wasn't just survival, it was strategy. Being first to a new water source meant choice grazing for your animals and time to collect and store before the inevitable crowd arrived. Being late meant muddy dregs, trampled plants, and possibly confrontation with whoever got there first. And in the desert, disputes over water were rarely just disputes. Sometimes the migrations were short, a few days' journey to a replenished spring. Other times, entire communities moved hundreds of kilometers, crossing open expanses where the only guarantee was that the sun would not be polite. You learned to read the sky for signs of distant rain, to listen for the sound of thunder rolling over invisible hills, and to smell the air for the faintest hint of wet dust. That smell could send a whole camp packing before dawn. And when you finally reached the new water, you didn't linger too long. The desert punishes complacency. Water here is like a guest that never stays the night. Enjoy it while it's in front of you, but keep your bags packed. The constant movement made permanent storage less important, but it didn't eliminate the need for ingenuity. Because sometimes you'd arrive just in time to find the water already gone, and then you'd need ways to pull it from places no one else thought to look. When the last puddle had dried, the animals had moved on, and even the plants looked like they were giving up. You didn't collapse, you got creative. There's always water in the desert. Not enough to fill a jug, but enough to keep you moving if you know how to tease it out of places most people wouldn't bother looking. Dew was the quiet ally. In the cold hours before dawn, moisture in the air settled in tiny beads across stone, sand, and sparse vegetation. It wasn't obvious. You had to crouch low, look for the faint glisten, and move fast before the sun erased it. Cloth, strips, fur, or even tufts of animal hair were dragged across grass or rock to collect the droplets, then wrung out into a container. It wasn't a drink, it was a wet mouthful, but out here, that counted. Stones and depressions in rock were checked at first light, especially shaded ones. Some would hold overnight condensation, a teaspoon here, a tablespoon there. You'd tip it carefully into a vessel or just drink directly, knowing you couldn't afford to spill a drop. It was slow work, the kind that made you measure your thirst against your patience. Certain plants were moisture banks in disguise. In the Kalahari, the sand people use fibrous roots from the bai plant, chewing them to release stored water. In other arid regions, mosses and lichens were collected for the same reason, not for taste, but for the liquid they surrendered reluctantly under pressure. These methods weren't improvisations, they were the result of centuries of observation, trial, and error. Even the wind could be turned into a source. In some coastal deserts, nets or cloth walls were erected to catch fog and condense it into droplets, a method still used in places like the Atacama today, though ancient versions were cruder and smaller. Far from the ocean, you might improvise by setting up a piece of cloth in the open night air, then wringing it out in the morning. And then there was digging. Not for deep wells, those came later, but for shallow scrapes. In low-lying ground, where moisture gathered just beneath the surface. Sand or soil was scooped away, and fibers or cloth laid in to absorb what seeped in. It might take hours for enough to collect, but in the absence of other options, time was a currency you were already spending. Every one of these techniques took energy, and energy meant losing water through sweat. The calculation was constant. Will the effort cost more liquid than it gives? This was desert economics at its most brutal. And yet, no matter how careful or inventive you were, these methods could only do so much. which is why entire societies built strict, unforgiving rules about who could access the real sources, the rare pools, springs, and rivers that kept everything alive. Finding water in the desert was one thing. Getting to actually use it was another. Out here, water wasn't just a resource, it was law, religion, and politics rolled into one shimmering pool. And before wells made supply less fragile, the rules around it were strict enough to make modern legal systems look like casual suggestions. The logic was simple. Scarcity turns everything into a power struggle. If you arrived at a spring or seasonal pool, you didn't just stroll up and start drinking. Access was controlled by whoever's territory it was in, a clan, a family, or sometimes a council of elders who had the authority to say yes, no, or wait your turn. In some North African and Arabian nomadic traditions, a stranger could be granted water, but only after certain formalities, not out of pettiness, but to keep order when tempers were already running dry. Hospitality rules were both survival mechanism and political theater. Among the Bedouin, for example, it was an obligation to offer water to guests before anything else. That wasn't generosity in the modern Instagram sense. It was a recognition that a thirsty guest might become a desperate one, and desperate people start wars. You gave them a drink to keep both of you alive. In some places, the source itself was treated as sacred. Springs might have been linked to spirits, gods, or ancestral protectors, and misuse was seen not just as theft but as sacrilege. Taboos might forbid washing clothes or animals in the same spot where people drank. Break that rule, and you didn't just anger the local chief, you risked being blamed for the next drought. Control could be more literal too. Guards were stationed at key water points, especially during the driest months. Their job wasn't just to enforce rationing but to prevent sabotage. Because poisoning a rival's waterhole wasn't an urban myth. It was a historical reality in some desert conflicts, and the kind of crime nobody forgave. Rights of access could be complex, passed down in oral agreements that balanced fairness with alliances. One family might have first rights on a certain day, another on the next. Animals might be watered in a set order by herd size or ownership. Violating the sequence could escalate from argument to armed confrontation in minutes. Even in emergencies, the rules applied. If you stumbled upon a guarded pool half dead from thirst, you'd still have to negotiate, or at least show you understood the hierarchy, before being allowed a share. Refusing water entirely was rare, but the portion given could be small enough to keep you alive, without letting you take advantage. These codes weren't just control for control's sake. They were the only thing preventing chaos in an environment where chaos meant death. And for as long as the rules held, people could coexist in relative peace around the same limited sources. But when they broke down, whether from drought, overuse, or greed, people were forced to move again, often in large, organized groups. And those groups, they had their own strategies for crossing vast distances, without direct access to water, relying on both their animals and their bodies to carry the liquid they needed. Crossing a desert without water wasn't reckless, it was routine. The difference between surviving it and being swallowed by it came down to planning, discipline, and the remarkable fact that both humans and animals can be turned into moving water tanks if you know how. The camel was the undisputed champion of this strategy, not because it stored water in its hump, that myth deserves to die already, but because its entire body was built to make the most of what it had. It could drink enough in one sitting to restore what it had lost over days, then stretch that reserve for a week or more. Its red blood cells are oval-shaped, which means they can keep flowing even when dehydration thickens the blood. And when it did sweat, it did so slowly, waiting until its body temperature climbed dangerously high before letting go of precious moisture. Humans adapted to match the camel's pace and schedule. Caravan routes were mapped, not just between known oases, but between points where animals could graze enough to keep producing milk. Milk wasn't a luxury here, it was hydration in liquid form, available on the move. In some cases, camels were milked while walking. The liquid passed two riders without stopping. For the people themselves, carrying large volumes of water was rare and risky. A full skin or gourd was heavy, and the more weight you carried, the faster you tired. The more you sweated, and the more you needed the very water you were hauling. Instead, travelers rationed ruthlessly, sometimes going 2 or 3 days without direct drinking, relying on milk, moist foods, or chewing on water-rich roots and fruits gathered along the way. The pace was deliberate, long stretches of slow walking, with the caravan breaking only when shade could be found or created. Midday movement was avoided unless absolutely necessary, and nights were used to cover distance when the air was cool. Even rest was strategic, lying down in a compact group to conserve warmth, avoiding the kind of sprawling posture that lost heat and moisture. And then there were the markers, small, cryptic signs along the route that told experienced travelers what to expect ahead. A particular arrangement of stones could mean water within half a day's march. A scratched symbol on a rock could warn of a dry season ahead. These weren't tourist signs. They were survival code, invisible to anyone who hadn't been taught to read them. A well-run caravan wasn't just transport, it was a moving ecosystem. Animals carried goods, humans carried knowledge, and between them they carried the desert's most valuable cargo, the ability to arrive somewhere alive. But even this system could fail, and when it did, people turned to the landscape itself, searching for life forms that hid water where the ground refused to give it up. When the skins were empty, the animals were dry, and the nearest spring was still a day too far. You didn't pray for rain, you looked for plants that had been hoarding it longer than you'd been alive. Out here, greenery wasn't scenery. It was a map to moisture, if you knew which ones to trust. Some plants made it obvious. Desert gourds, for instance, pale, round, and sitting smugly on the sand like they owned the place. The sand of the Kalahari relied on the summer melon in the dry season, cracking it open for its watery pulp and seeds. It wasn't sweet, and it certainly wasn't refreshing in the way you think of refreshment, but it kept you walking. Others hid their generosity under a layer of hostility. Wild cucumbers, thorny shrubs, and certain types of desert squash held liquid in their flesh, but you had to cut, peel, or pound them into submission before they'd give it up. You didn't snack on these for pleasure. You processed them like stubborn prisoners who needed convincing. Roots were another secret reservoir. In parts of southern Africa and Australia, people dug up fibrous roots, sliced or chewed them, and spat out the pulp after squeezing out every drop. This wasn't elegant, it left you with dirt in your mouth and grit in your teeth, but it was water, and that made it fine dining by desert standards. Then there was aloe, not the pretty bottled gel from the pharmacy, the raw, bitter kind you could slice open and suck moisture from. It came with the side benefit of soothing a sunburn, though in truth, benefit is too generous a word for the taste. If your tongue could speak, it would file a complaint. Of course, the desert also offers plants that will end you faster than thirst if you pick wrong. Euphorbias, for example, contain milky sap that can burn skin and cause severe stomach trouble. The kind of trouble you can't afford when you're already dehydrated, which is why plant knowledge wasn't a hobby. It was survival literacy. Get it wrong once, and you wouldn't get a second chance. The key was moderation. Even safe plants could backfire if you ate too much at once. Some were so fibrous they demanded more water to digest than they gave, leaving you in worse shape than before. Others worked best combined with fatty foods or milk to slow down how fast your body burned through the moisture. This plant knowledge wasn't improvised in the moment. It was inherited, passed down through songs, stories, and hands-on teaching. A child might be sent to fetch a melon, shown how to tell a ripe one from a bitter one, and taught the consequences of getting it wrong. The stakes were never theoretical. Still, even the best plant sources had limits. They could get you through a few days, maybe a week, but in the long stretches between rains, the margin between survival and collapse was razor-thin. And when that edge approached, people learned to recognize the signs their bodies were about to lose the fight. The first hint isn't thirst, it's distraction. You'll catch yourself staring too long at nothing, forgetting why you moved your foot in the first place. Words don't come easily, and when they do, they feel slow, like they're being pulled through sand inside your head. That's your brain protecting what little liquid is left, deciding conversation isn't worth the cost. A dry mouth is almost polite compared to what follows. The skin on your lips begins to crack. Your tongue feels swollen, thick, heavy enough to trip over. Sweat stops coming, which at first feels like a relief. No more dampness, until you realize it's because your body has officially filed for bankruptcy. Muscles start behaving like they've been replaced with knotted rope. Simple movements turn awkward. Bending feels like a chore, standing like a gamble. The calves cramp first, then the thighs, and every step becomes a quiet negotiation between willpower and collapse. Your heartbeat gets ambitious, pounding faster to keep blood moving despite the lack of fluid to carry it. Each beat feels louder in your head, accompanied by a faint ringing in the ears. That sound is your body's equivalent of a low battery warning. Breathing changes too. It becomes shallow, quick, and oddly loud, as if you've been sprinting when all you've done is stand still. Even resting feels expensive, like you're spending water you don't have just to exist. The eyes start to ache. Blinking slows, partly from fatigue, partly because the body is rationing tears. If you can cry at this stage, you're better off than you think. It means there's still enough to spare for something useless. Most people can't. Then comes the confusion. Not the dramatic, movie-style hallucinations of palm trees and fountains, but subtle mistakes. Forgetting the direction you were walking, thinking you've already passed the same rock 3 times, doubting whether you've actually seen movement on the horizon or just imagined it. The cruelest part is that the mind starts offering bad ideas. You'll want to sit down just for a moment, and that's how people are found hours later, still sitting. The urge to rest feels rational. It isn't. Stillness at this stage is an invitation for the heat to finish the job. Among groups used to living in water scarcity, these signs were spotted early. The weakest walker was given sips from the shared supply. Loads were redistributed. Shade became the priority. It wasn't sentiment, it was math. A collapsing person slowed everyone, and slowing everyone meant more time in the heat. Even so, intervention could only work if there was something to intervene with. Which is why water, when found, was treated with almost ceremonial care, not just in how it was drunk, but in how it was stored and guarded against disappearance. The moment water stopped moving and started staying put, everything else began to shift with it. Wells didn't just quench thirst, they rewrote the map, the calendar, and the logic of survival. Before them, the rhythm of life was migration. Follow the rain, follow the flood, follow the green. After them, life could root itself to a single spot. Permanent access meant permanent settlements. Families who once carried their homes on their backs began stacking on mud brick, knowing they wouldn't need to leave in 2 weeks. Livestock pens stayed in place. Fields could be planted and tended without the looming fear that the next sunrise would force everyone to pack up. Trade exploded. Routes that were once dangerous gambles became predictable corridors, with wells spaced just far enough apart to keep caravans moving. Market days grew around these fixed points, pulling in people from miles away. Goods could be transported more cheaply, because you no longer had to carry every drop of water you might need for the journey. Someone along the way had already hauled it up from the earth for you. Politics changed too. Whoever controlled the well controlled the settlement, the grazing rights, and the trade. Disputes over water became disputes over property, shifting power from those who could find water to those who could own it. In some places, entire clans rose or fell on the strength of a single deep shaft and the ropes that drew life from it. The skills honed over generations, tracking hidden springs, harvesting dew, reading the land for buried moisture began to fade. They didn't vanish overnight, but each year that a community relied on its well, fewer children learned the old ways. Why chew roots for a mouthful of bitter liquid when a bucket and a pulley would do? And yet, reliance brought its own fragility. A broken rope, a silted shaft, or a poisoned well could cripple an entire settlement. People who had once been able to survive weeks without direct water found themselves helpless if their single source failed. Even so, the pull of stability was stronger than the fear of dependence. Wells made it possible to think beyond tomorrow's thirst, to plant orchards, to build walls, to store grain. They gave rise to towns, then cities, then the kind of political systems that need permanent addresses. The great irony was that as soon as water became predictable, humans started treating it as if it were infinite, a dangerous assumption in any age. And just like that, thousands of years of fierce, ingenious, nomadic watercraft began slipping into memory, preserved only in fragments, an elder's half-told story. A ritual no one could quite explain, a proverb about the green at the base of a hill. The knowledge didn't die. It just became the sort of thing you didn't bother to remember until the day the well ran dry. In some places, water was never the unquestioned drink of life. It could be brackish, seasonal, crawling with the kinds of parasites that make you wish for an early grave. Entire civilizations bloomed in places where rivers ran muddy, wells soured, and every gulp carried a wager. so people looked elsewhere, not just for safety, but for meaning. Because if you're going to replace the one thing the body can't live without, it had better be with something the gods notice. In the dry uplands, on the steppe, in savannas dotted with thin cattle, water often stepped aside for thicker, stranger fluids. A herd became a reservoir, a beehive, a liquid vault, and before long, necessity became ritual, and ritual became the kind of tradition no one dared question, lest the sky take offense. Milk was the first to claim the throne, not the sanitized carton-born version, but milk warm from the udder, with a pulse of steam in the morning air. In pastoral worlds, cattle, camels, mares, even reindeer were more than beasts. They were moving wells, translating grass into drinkable sustenance. The Mongols made a science of it, turning mare's milk into airag, frothy and sour, the taste of nomad endurance. The Maasai cut it with cow blood, a blend rich enough to survive dry seasons when the rivers shrank into mud veins. In the far north, Sami herders leaned on reindeer milk, so thick it was more like cream, keeping children alive through winters where water meant ice and ice meant death if you touched it wrong. It wasn't just nourishment, milk was status, identity, a birthright measured in liters. Among the Fulani, a bride's value could be counted in her skill at milking and in the health of the animals she tended. Among the Bedouin, camel's milk was not only food but medicine, offered to honored guests with the gravity of a royal seal. And always, it was a social substance, passed around in bowls or skins, binding a household in the shared act of drinking. There were taboos to animals not to be milked, times of year when fresh milk was considered dangerous, even curses reserved for those who spilled it carelessly. Milk, in these worlds, wasn't simply what filled the cup. It was what kept the order of things. A dry udder could mean hunger, yes, but also misfortune, the hint of a broken pact between humans, animals, and the unseen. Which is why, in some places, milk alone wasn't enough. The liquid had to be darkened, enriched, made into something stronger, something that carried the unmistakable pulse of life itself. Blood had a different weight in the mouth, metallic, faintly sweet, carrying the heat of the body it came from. In pastoral landscapes, where the herd was the pantry, butchered meat was a loss too great for every dry month, so the animal's life was tapped instead of taken. Among the Maasai, a sharp arrow nicked the jugular of a cow, releasing a thin arc into a calabash. The wound was sealed with dung and clay. The animal lived, the people drank. It was survival without slaughter, though not without ceremony. Blood was mixed with milk, thickened into a drink that could stand in for water entirely during droughts. Nomadic armies learned the same trick. Mongol riders on campaign could draw a little blood from their horses to keep moving through weeks without streams. It wasn't desperation alone, there was a belief in its power. Blood was strength condensed, the animal's stamina flowing into the human vein. Warriors swore oaths over it, sealing loyalty in the most literal way possible. To drink from the same vein was to be bound, not just in friendship, but in obligation, an alliance you didn't break without expecting to see that blood again, spilled for real. It moved easily between the practical and the symbolic. Blood offered to the earth was food for spirits, a way to keep the world in balance. In the Horn of Africa, camel blood was poured into the sand before migrations, asking the land to receive its people again. In the far north, hunters marked the snow with the first drops from a kill. Not as waste, but as payment, a transaction between predator and prey. And in nearly every place it was used, blood carried the warning that it was not to be taken lightly. You didn't drink it for pleasure. You drank it for survival, for ritual, for the kind of promise that left an iron taste long after the cup was empty. And sometimes, survival had a sweetness to it, a sweetness so rare it was measured in God's favor rather than in spoonfuls. That's when the hive replaced the well, and honey became the drink of choice. Honey was the sort of liquid you didn't gulp, you coaxed it. It came guarded, sealed behind comb and stinger, and getting it meant smoke, patience, and a tolerance for pain. Where water ran unreliable and milk belonged to the herd, honey was the luxury that arrived in golden drops, dense enough to last months without spoiling. Its rarity gave it an immediate place in the sacred, an offering the gods might actually notice. In the highlands of Ethiopia, honey wine tej flowed in clay jars during feasts that marked births, marriages, and victories. In the Nordic forests, mead was brewed in longhouses, its sweetness cutting through winters that dulled every other flavor. The Maya mixed honey into ceremonial drinks, folding it into cacao or pulque, blending intoxication with divinity. Even in Vedic India, honey was a component of morju, the nectar of immortality, poured in rituals to bridge the gap between the human and the eternal. Its properties made it more than food. Honey healed, sealed wounds, soothed throats, and preserved the dead. Jars of it have been found in Egyptian tombs, still edible after 3,000 years, as if the bees had agreed to work for the afterlife. It was poured into the mouths of statues to feed the gods, spread on altars to tempt them into kindness, and mixed into initiation drinks that blurred the edge between sweetness and oblivion. But honey's role as water's replacement wasn't just about taste or preservation. It was about concentration, the idea that in a single sticky drop lay the work of hundreds of creatures, days of bloom, miles of flight. To drink it was to take in the distilled labor of a whole microcosm, to make that energy part of one's own, and that made it fit for rituals where something precious had to be given or taken. Which is why, in more than one culture, milk, blood, and honey weren't just alternatives to water. They were the liquids poured out when the gods themselves were thirsty. Sometimes those gods were imagined as far above. Sometimes they were seated right there in the temple, waiting for the first splash on the stone. In temples where no stream flowed and no well could be dug deep enough, the altars still glistened, not with water, but with what people believed the gods preferred, the liquids that carried life, wealth, and something of the body itself. Milk, blood, honey, each poured with the precision of someone feeding a guest who could destroy the house if displeased. Archaeologists have brushed away centuries of dust to find dried traces of these offerings, calcium signatures from milk in Libyan desert shrines, iron-rich residue from blood poured in Bronze Age Anatolia, faint sugar crystals in vessels left in Minoan sanctuaries. The choice wasn't just about availability, it was about symbolic equivalence. Water sustained life. These other liquids were life, thicker, rarer, and bound up with labor, risk, or sacrifice. In some Canaanite rituals, milk flowed around the base of idols, as if nourishing the gods from the roots up. Among the Maya, honey was dripped onto carved stones in patterns meant to sweeten divine judgment. In the Horn of Africa, animal blood was flung against the entrance of a sacred site to mark the threshold between mortal and spirit territory. And everywhere, the act carried the same unspoken understanding. You don't give the gods something cheap. Even funerary rites absorbed the logic. In certain tombs along the Nile, jars of milk and honey sat beside the dead, a refreshment for the journey beyond, an assurance that even in the arid lands of the underworld, the traveler wouldn't be forced to drink plain water like a commoner. Blood was rarer there, but when present, it spoke of kinship obligations, a literal sharing of the body to carry a soul across the unseen. And in a few places, the source of the offering was even more intimate, not from a herd or hive, but from the human body itself. There are records carved, painted, whispered through the folds of old songs, of times when the drink given was not from a beast or blossom, but from human flesh itself. The body could be the well, and its milk the proof that life continued, even in famine or grief. In medieval Europe, wet nurses kept the children of the wealthy alive when their mothers couldn't or wouldn't, a profession as intimate as it was transactional. But far older and stranger are the moments when human milk was offered not to infants, but to gods, spirits, and the sick. In parts of the ancient Mediterranean, statues of goddesses were anointed with it, their stone mouths touched with drops, said to renew their power. In Hindu myth, milk from the breast of a mother could purify poison, a tale mirrored in Ethiopian folk medicine, where a lactating woman might feed a fevered man in the belief that her body's nourishment could draw the illness out. There's an echo of it too. In Christian iconography, saints shown squirting thin arcs of milk into the mouths of the faithful, a spiritual feeding layered on top of the physical. This wasn't charity. It was a deliberate transfer, warmth, immunity, and whatever invisible thread bound the child to survival, passed into another body, or across the altar to a waiting idol. And like all liquids that replaced water, it came with rules. Who could give it? Who could receive it? When it was a blessing and when it was a defilement. Breaking those rules could sour the act, turning what was meant to nourish into an insult. Milk from the human body blurred the line between sustenance and sacrifice, a line that blood crossed without hesitation. In some worlds, that crossing was done in peace. In others, it was learned in war. On the move, with no wells to draw from, and no time to hunt for streams, warriors learned that a living animal could be a waterskin with a heartbeat. Steppe riders were notorious for it, the Mongols most famously nicking a vein in a horse's neck to take a swallow of warm blood before sealing the wound and riding on. It wasn't an act of cruelty, at least not in their eyes, but a way to keep both man and mount alive until the next camp. Other armies adapted the practice in harsher climates. Turkic nomads, Berber raiders, even Viking crews caught in Arctic drifts, all recorded moments when blood became their only drink. It was fuel that didn't just hydrate, it fed muscles, staved off collapse, and for those who believed, carried the animal's courage into the drinker. Some commanders made it a ritual before battle, a shared cup binding the fighters together more tightly than any oath carved in stone. But blood in war wasn't just for the living. In the Sahel, warriors returning from raids poured a libation of animal blood on the earth before re-entering their home settlements, feeding the land so it wouldn't take vengeance for the violence done elsewhere. Among the Scythians, prisoners' blood was sometimes drunk in initiation, not out of hunger, but as a symbolic absorption of the enemy's strength. However grim the logic, survival bled into ritual until the two were indistinguishable. What began as a practical solution to thirst became part of the identity of those who lived by the sword, and in the rare moments when the fighting paused, another liquid, gentler, but no less potent, could take its place in the cup, fermenting sweetness from scarcity. Fermentation was a kind of alchemy, turning the slow labor of bees into a drink that could outlast seasons and loosen tongues. Honey on its own was precious, but honey turned into mead was something else entirely. In the grassy kingdoms of early Europe, it was the drink of warriors at victory feasts, poured into horn cups that smelled faintly of beeswax and smoke. In the Horn of Africa, honey beer-filled clay jugs for weddings, where the first sip wasn't just about pleasure, but about sealing the couple's bond with a sweetness meant to linger. It wasn't always for the many. In some African kingdoms, only chiefs could drink honey brews outside of festivals, the bees' work reserved for those whose words carried law. In Vedic India, honey drinks marked initiations, taken by priests, warriors, and nobles as part of rituals that folded intoxication into spiritual awakening. The Maya blended honey with balch, a mildly hallucinogenic tree bark infusion, producing visions sweet enough to convince you the gods were leaning in to listen. Fermentation transformed honey from preservative to provocateur. It could make a winter gathering feel like summer, turn negotiations into confessions, and, in the right doses, dissolve the hard edges of grief or rivalry. But it was also a liquid with rules. Too much, and a leader risked disgrace. Too little, and the gods might take offense for being offered weak drink. Mead wasn't simply consumed, it was performed, measured, and sometimes withheld entirely to make its eventual arrival feel like a blessing. And in places where honey and milk and blood all appeared together, they could become a complete replacement for water, the daily drink, the sacred libation, the survival ration. Which is why in some lands, people didn't speak of thirst in terms of rivers or wells, but of whether the herd was strong. The bees were busy, and the flocks were lactating. That dependence on the herd, and the seasons that ruled it, shaped not just survival, but the very rhythm of daily life. In landscapes where water was a gamble, the day's first drink might come from a goat's udder, not a clay jar. Pastoral calendars read more like milking schedules than lunar charts. The health of the herd dictating when a family could drink freely and when they would stretch each cup with grain or fat. Among the Tuareg, camel's milk could keep a traveler alive for weeks, its richness replacing both water and solid food. In the Arctic, Inuit families relied on seal blood and broth, their liquids extracted from meat rather than riverbanks locked in ice. Season determined not just the quantity but the texture of what was drunk. Spring milk was thin and sweet. Late summer milk was dense, yellowed with fat. Drought years meant more blood drawn from animals and less fresh milk to go around, while seasons of plenty might bring enough surplus for cheesemaking, butter churning, and ceremonial overpouring, spilling some on the earth as thanks, or to tempt rain back. Even honey was seasonal, appearing in bursts after blooms, hoarded in jars until the time came to drink it or feed it to guests of honor. These liquids weren't interchangeable. They were layered into identity. A Mongol might boast of surviving a month on mare's milk alone, while a Maasai elder could measure past droughts by how often they had to open a cow's vein. In such worlds, thirst was never a simple dryness in the mouth, it was a state that could be read in the herd's ribs, the bee's silence, the absence of jars in the storehouse, and when any of those signs appeared, survival depended on knowing which alternative the body could take, and which the gods would accept. Because these drinks weren't just for humans, they also fed the altars, the dead, and the spirits that guarded what little water existed. And in some places, giving the right liquid could mean the difference between a blessing and a blight, even after rivers ran clean and wells deepened past the reach of drought. The old drinks stayed. They lingered not out of necessity, but out of memory, each cup carrying more story than flavor. Milk still appeared in offerings across East Africa, poured in thin lines onto the earth, for ancestors who once survived whole seasons on nothing else. Blood was reserved for moments of binding, sealing a pact, sanctifying a marriage, or promising that a feud would end. Honey, sweet and incorruptible, remained the gift of choice for deities who could not be bribed with coins. Symbolism clung to them like residue on a jar. Milk spoke of purity, but also of obligation, the silent pact between herder and herd. Blood was the vitality that made promises dangerous to break, the reminder that life could be measured in what flowed. Honey was the luxury that turned scarcity into celebration, a distillation of effort that hinted at paradise. Together, they could stand in for water, not just in the cup, but in the imagination, liquids that fed the body and the spirit in ways a stream never could. In modern rites, they show up in gestures that seem quaint until their weight is understood. A sip of milk at a wedding, a drop of blood in a warrior's initiation, a smear of honey on a newborn's lips. Each is a survival story disguised as a blessing, and each is a fragment of a time when thirst could only be quenched by what the herd, the hive, or the vein was willing to give. But the old habit of replacing water didn't always stop at ritual or ceremony. Sometimes it carried on into the afterlife, the same way it began, with the belief that there are thirsts too important for water to touch. In the end, what began as a workaround for bad wells and dry seasons hardened into theology. The liquids that once replaced water became the ones that replaced it in prayer, in law, in the invisible contracts between humans and whatever forces they believed held the world steady. Milk, blood, and honey weren't just provisions. They were currencies, proofs of worth, and tokens of devotion. In burial chambers from the Sahara to the steppe, jars still wait at the feet of the dead, some dust dry, some sealed so well that the faint scent of sweetness lingers thousands of years later. They were meant to sustain a journey beyond rivers, to keep a soul from lowering its lips to water unworthy of its status. And for the living, those same liquids framed the idea of what was precious. Water might be abundant now, but these other drinks still carried the weight of being finite, risky, and costly to take. Even stripped of their survival role, they kept their aura of danger and privilege. Milk was never just milk once it had been part of an offering. Blood could never be just nourishment once it had sealed an oath. Honey could never be just food once it had fed a god. They remained reminders that survival was once a matter of what the herd would give, what the body could spare, and what the bees had hidden. And perhaps that's the quiet truth beneath all of it. Replacing water wasn't only about thirst. It was about transforming something fleeting into something sacred. About making every sip feel like it carried the weight of the world, or at least the favor of the sky. Because long after the rivers returned, people still poured milk into the dust, bled a vein, or dripped honey on stone, just to be certain that the gods, like their ancestors, drank the good stuff. In places where the horizon was too far to mean anything, sight was almost useless. The ocean gave no landmarks, deserts no silhouettes, tundras nothing but flat white, and the occasional insult from the wind. People learned early that direction couldn't always be found in what could be seen. Sometimes it lived in what could be tasted. A dry mouth wasn't always thirst. It could be a map. The air carried its own cartography, a faint film of salt on the lips, a bitterness under the tongue, the mineral temps of rock dust miles away. In the Pacific, where water was everywhere but never drinkable, this skill was survival stitched into daily life. Swells, clouds, and stars told part of the story, but the wind finished it. A sudden sweetness might mean land, pollen carried far out to sea, riding a breeze that had brushed through a grove of flowering trees, A sharper, green taste came from the breath of distant reefs, algae and broken coral ground fine by waves. In the absence of gull cries or drifting leaves, the air's flavor alone could tell a navigator whether they were approaching safety or rowing toward an empty horizon. It wasn't instinct. It was learned, tested, and corrected the way others learned to read. A child on a canoe might be asked where the wind had been last night, or what changed after dawn. Their answer weighed against what the elders felt on their own tongues. Accuracy wasn't optional. A mistake could mean days lost at sea, provisions running low, and a return to shore with nothing but the humiliation of explaining that the wind had lied, when everyone knew it never lied, only whispered in a dialect the untrained couldn't hear. And that dialect wasn't limited to the ocean. There were other places, hotter and quieter, where the air's taste was the only compass worth trusting. Out on the open Pacific, the wind had a signature as distinct as handwriting, shifting not just with direction, but with what it had brushed against before it reached the canoe. For navigators in Polynesia and Micronesia, that meant the air was never just wind. It was salted in a dozen different ways, each one hinting at where land might be hiding beyond the curve of the horizon. An easterly carrying the dry sting of open water told them nothing new. It was the default, the steady breath of the ocean's spine. But a sudden heaviness in the air, a thicker salt that clung to the lips, might mean waves breaking on a reef ahead. Sometimes the flavor went faintly green, like crushed seaweed left too long in the sun, and that was the scent of a lagoon still hours away. If the taste sweetened just slightly, it could be the dust of pollen, breadfruit, or pandanus blooms that had drifted miles from shore. The process was never solitary. A navigator would crouch low, facing into the breeze, mouth just open enough to catch it, while others scanned the water for signs, bird flight, debris, cloud shapes. But the taste often came first, long before the eyes could find anything. Stories tell of sailors recognizing the air of a particular island days before sighting it, naming it from the blend of salt, flowers, and earth baked under the same sun for generations. And while ocean voyagers learned the taste of far-off forests and reefs, those who lived where the horizon shimmered with heat instead of water had their own wind maps, carved not in salt, but in dust in the desert. The wind didn't so much arrive as it announced itself, a dry hiss over the sand, carrying particles so fine they could slip between teeth. For the Bedouin and Tuareg, that grit was more than an irritation. It was an index. Each patch of desert had its own dust, shaped by the minerals beneath it, the way it broke down under centuries of wind. A mouthful of pale, chalky air might mean limestone flats ahead. A sharper, metallic temp could hint at iron-rich hills still over the horizon. The body learned these tastes the way others learned a skyline. During sandstorms, when the world turned the color of old parchment and the sun vanished entirely, taste became the only compass worth trusting. Riders could angle themselves by the flavor of the grit hitting their tongues, adjusting course toward oases they'd never seen but had reached 100 times before. In seasons of migration, elders tested the wind each morning before deciding where the herds could be moved. A faint sweetness in the air meaning grassland ahead. A sour dryness warning of another stretch of salt flats. It wasn't romantic. The air could rasp the throat raw, lodge in the gums, leave a day's worth of grit between the molars. But for those who lived in it, that was part of reading the map. The desert offered no shade for the eyes, no sound for the ears, so it taught the tongue to do the looking instead. Far to the north, other people read a different kind of wind, one without dust, yet still sharp enough to cut. Its taste didn't scrape the mouth. It stung. In the remote northlands, the wind carried no dust, no pollen, no desert grit to chew on, only cold, layered in flavors too subtle for anyone who hadn't grown up inside them. Among Inuit hunters and Sami herders, that bite in the air could mean the difference between safe passage and a slow death on shifting ice. The taste of the wind wasn't just temperature, it was texture. A dry, almost metallic cold might mean sea ice ahead, tight and unbroken. A damp, heavy chill often hinted at open water somewhere beyond the next ridge, where the ice had fractured into leads. Some hunters swore they could tell where seal breathing holes lay. By the way the air changed near them, a faint richness from the water's breath, pushing up through the snow like a secret trying to escape. The same skill worked in reverse. A thin, almost papery cold warned of pressure ridges, where ice slabs had buckled into hidden walls that could trap a sled. Wind from the inland tundra carried another vocabulary, the faint musk of reindeer herds drifting for miles, the resin of dwarf pines thawing in the brief summer light. But in the depths of winter, when the land was stripped to bone white, even those faded away, and what remained was the pure taste of cold itself. Hunters learned to weigh it, to decide whether to push forward or turn back, measuring the miles ahead not in footsteps, but in how far their tongues could still read the air. In warmer latitudes, the same skill played out in places where cold never came, in forests so dense that the air's flavor was shaped not by ice, but by leaves, resin, and the slow rot of the jungle floor. Within the dripping emerald wilderness, wind didn't arrive in long, clean lines the way it did over sea or sand. It curled, broke apart, and reassembled in pockets, each carrying a fragment of the forest's endless ferment. For the hunter slipping through the Amazon undergrowth, or the forager moving under a Southeast Asian canopy, that patchwork of air could be read like a shifting mosaic. The taste was never neutral. The resin of certain trees left a faint bitterness at the back of the throat, marking where their trunks leaned over a hidden trail. Flowering seasons sweetened the air to the point of dizziness. Orchids, for instance, carrying their perfume far beyond sight, drawing both insects and humans toward the same clearing. The musk of large animals drifted low and damp, clinging to the breath of the wind long after the creatures had moved on. Even the tang of wet stone, sharp and mineral-heavy, could betray a stream hidden under layers of vine and root. The most skilled navigators wove these flavors together without thinking, tasting not just direction but time. A breeze rich with fallen fruit meant the height of a season. The flat, dusty taste of decomposing leaves could mean the rains were near. And because the forest floor swallowed sound and light, the tongue often caught the first hint of what was coming, a distant cooking fire, the acid-sweet trace of fermented sap, the bitter smoke of a lightning-struck tree. In places where seasons swung violently, wind didn't just speak of direction or location. It warned, sometimes hours ahead, of weather that could strip a camp to the bones. Its taste was the first alarm bell. Storms announced themselves long before the first cloud showed its face. If you knew what to drink from the wind, sailors on the Pacific felt it as a thickening, a strange heaviness on the lips, saltier than usual, as if the ocean had leaned closer to whisper something unpleasant. The moisture clung, coating the tongue in a way that made swallowing a deliberate act. For those who had spent decades reading the horizon, this was the taste of an approaching squall. In some archipelagos, old navigators could name the specific islands a storm had passed over by the trace of their pollen or volcanic dust still riding in the gale. On high mountain plateaus in the Andes, herders learned a different warning. Before the summer thunderstorms rolled up from the lowlands, the wind would go acrid, faintly metallic, like licking a coin. Scientists today would call it ozone, but to the herders it was simply the bite. A flavor that made animals restless and pushed shepherds to gather their flocks before the sky split open. In the Himalayas, the same bitterness in the mouth could precede a snowstorm. The taste carried on an air so dry and sharp, it felt as though it could cut. In desert coasts, monsoon sailors read a palate that could change within minutes. A wind that had been bland and chalky at dawn could turn briny by mid-morning, signaling a shift in currents far offshore. If that salt thickened and was followed by a sudden coolness, the monsoon was likely hours away, a change that meant survival only if sails were lowered and harbors found before the first wall of rain slammed in. These warnings weren't guesses. They were hard-earned, passed on through quiet, practical teaching. A boy sent to stand at the bow to taste for storms before the elders made their decision. A girl told to pause in the pasture and breathe deeply when the goats began to bunch together. In each case, the body became a barometer, and sometimes what it tasted on the wind had nothing to do with weather. Sometimes it was the echo of events unfolding far away, the kind you could smell, taste, and dread long before you could see. There were winds that carried more than weather. They brought news, whether or not you wanted to hear it. On volcanic islands, people could taste the Earth's restlessness days before an eruption, a faint bitterness in the air. Ash so fine it slipped past the nostrils and settled straight on the tongue, told of something breaking open miles away. That taste, mixed with the faint warmth of the wind, was enough to make fishermen haul their nets early and children kept indoors, without a single plume yet visible on the horizon. In the steppes and savannas, fire had its own vocabulary. Grass fire smoke was dry and almost sweet, leaving the lips coated as if with dusted resin. Forest fires were different, thicker, oilier, heavy with the ghost of burned leaves, and both could be tasted before they were seen. Among certain herding peoples, elders could tell which direction to flee simply by pressing their tongue to the roof of the mouth, and feeling where the burnt taste sat heavier. Even war could ride the wind. Armies on the move carried the scent and taste of their own presence. Sweat, animal dung. Iron chroniclers in the Levant wrote of desert winds arriving with the taste of the forge, long before scouts brought word of advancing troops. Sometimes it was subtler still, the faint tang of disturbed earth, kicked up by hundreds of feet and hooves, a taste that stuck in the teeth as if the land itself was bracing. And in quieter places, there were omens that defied logic. Winds that tasted wrong, a flavor no one could quite name, might be read as a warning from spirits, the ancestors, or the land. That unease could halt a journey before it began, or send a caravan along a longer, safer road. Such skills were rarely accidents. They were cultivated the way a musician trains an ear, slowly, deliberately, with endless repetition, until the knowledge is lodged, not in the mind but in the body. Which is why, in cultures that navigated by taste, the ability wasn't just learned, it was inherited, passed down in long apprenticeships, where the first lesson wasn't where to go, but how to read the air itself. Learning to read the wind through the mouth was never as simple as just stepping outside and licking the air. In cultures that depended on it, the training began early, long before a child understood the stakes. They'd be sent out with elders at dawn, when the air was still shifting from night to day, and told to stand in silence. No pointing, no guessing, just breathing with intention, holding the air at the back of the throat, letting the flavor settle. Then came the questions. Where has the wind been? What has it touched? At first, the answers were wrong. The air from the sea tasted like the river. The scent of blooming plants was confused for smoke, but little by little, distinctions sharpened. Apprentices were taught to wet their lips so that fine particles would stick, to breathe lightly through their teeth, to catch the sharpness of mineral dust, to turn slowly in place to find the edge where one flavor faded into another. It wasn't just about naming a taste, it was about matching it to a map in the mind. Among Pacific navigators, each island had its own wind signature, a composite of reef spray, vegetation, and soil that had to be memorized through seasons. In the desert, the same skill meant recognizing the difference between a dry wind that had passed over salt flats and one that had swept through pastureland days before. In the north, the practice might involve tasting the difference between the breath of glacial ice and the musk of distant herds, carried across frozen plains. This was knowledge stored in muscle memory, not in books. An apprentice who failed to learn might never be trusted with long voyages, herd migrations, or solo hunts. And for those who mastered it, the tongue became a compass, one that didn't rust, break, or run out of fuel. But mastery also brought something else, a place in the stories. Because in many cultures, the ability to taste the wind wasn't just practical, it was touched by the sacred, woven into myth as a gift from powers that breathed over the world long before humans walked it. In many traditions, a wind that could be read was also a wind that could speak. Myths grew around the idea that the air's flavor came from more than dust or salt, that it carried the breath of deities, ancestors, or spirits moving unseen. In parts of Polynesia, certain steady breezes were personified as guiding relatives, born from the bones of navigators who had died at sea. In the Sahel, some herders spoke of milkwinds in the dry season, a sweet-tasting current believed to be the breath of rain-bringing spirits drifting ahead of the clouds. There were winds that were considered safe to taste, and winds that were not. The death winds of Central Asian steppe legend carried an acrid, almost metallic temps. To linger in them was to risk sickness or misfortune. In the Arctic, some elders cautioned against tasting the first wind after a long, dark winter. Its sharp, biting cold was said to carry the memory of starvation years, and to let it into the body was to invite scarcity. Wind readers themselves often sat halfway between navigator and ritual specialist. A skilled one might be called upon not just to guide a canoe or a caravan, but to interpret a change in the air before a festival or ceremony. If the taste was sweetened unexpectedly, it could mean approval from the gods. If it turned bitter, plans might be postponed entirely. Some winds were even courted, fires lit, herbs burned, songs sung in hopes of coaxing a particular current to arrive. In this way, wine tasting straddled two worlds, one rooted in survival, the other in cosmology, and like many skills, balanced between the practical and the sacred. It was vulnerable to being forgotten when the tools of navigation changed and the old apprenticeships thinned, because the wind still carried its stories. But fewer and fewer people remembered how to drink them from the air. By the time compasses, maps, and GPS units took over, the skill of tasting the wind had already been retreating for generations. Ships no longer needed a navigator crouched at the bow, lips parted to catch the first hint of pollen from an unseen island. Caravans crossed deserts guided by printed charts instead of the grit on their tongues. Even in the north, snowmobiles and radios replaced the quiet art of standing still to feel where the cold had come from. The change wasn't sudden. In many places the knowledge lingered in fragments, an elder remarking on the sweetness in the air before rain, a fisherman idly noting that the wind tastes wrong on the morning of a storm. But without the long apprenticeships, without the daily necessity, the sense dulled. Younger generations might still hear the stories, but they no longer needed to verify them with their own mouths. The wind became weather, not a map. Anthropologists arriving too late could only record the remnants, a Polynesian navigator recalling the taste of a certain island's wind but unable to pass it on without a canoe. A Tuareg herder explaining the difference between a salt wind and a pasture wind while sipping bottled water. An Arctic hunter smiling faintly as he described how the air above a seal hole tasted warm. In each case, the knowledge lived only in memory, not in practice. What was lost wasn't just a technique. It was a way of perceiving the world where the body itself was the instrument, and where direction came not from looking outward, but from letting the landscape settle, invisibly, on the tongue. The wind still moves with the same flavors it always had: salt from unseen reefs, ash from far-off fires, the green sweetness of a forest in bloom. But now, most of it passes unnoticed, carrying maps for mouths that have forgotten how to read.